Professor Mike Sharwood-Smith, thank you so much for being here, for supporting this project.
Yes, thank you. Glad to be here.
So I wanted to start this interview with my experience with MOGLE, because the first time I saw the diagram with the whole framework, it was in Mitchell et al.'s book about SLA theories. And I thought, all these boxes, all these connections, all these things, it's so complicated. Who made this? Who can understand this? So it seemed a little bit complex at first, at least. And then when I started to seriously read about it and see when I saw all the smaller pieces, everything started to come together and make sense. And yeah, so now there is no problem. So I want to reproduce that experience for the audience, and that will be the intention of the second video. But in this first part, I want to discuss kind of the intermediate steps, so that when people read about the MCF, they have the necessary context to understand where the theory comes from and what kind of linguistics it uses. But first of all, some people may have heard about MOGLE, and they may be wondering, what is the difference between the MOGLE framework, and the MCF? Is there a difference?
Okay, yes. So the short answer is there's no difference at all. But we changed the name of MOGLE in, I think it was 2017, because we realized that we were missing something, and what we were missing was to broadcast the idea that this framework, whatever it was called, is not just about language. It's about the whole mind. And the history of how we approached this was very much that we wanted to sort some particular problem in second language acquisition. And then we found that we needed to incorporate general views about language and grammar. And having done that, we realized very quickly that you can't really explain language without understanding or having some particular way of looking at the mind. So basically, we can look at lots of different things in the MCF, although we are both interested in psychology and linguistics. That has been the major push. So as it were, MOGLE says this is about how language works in the mind, and MCF says this is also about other things as well.
I think something that will leave an impression in people when they start reading about the MCF, number one is, of course, these complex diagrams, but number two is we read that it is a generative theory, or it comes from generative linguistics. But it really comes from a very specific type of generative theory, which is Jack and Duff's theory of the parallel architecture. So how does Jack and Duff's theory depart from Chomskyan linguistics, which is what most people would perhaps associate with generative linguistics?
Yes, okay, so although they share the basic assumptions about all generative linguistics, all the various versions of generative linguistics, the mainstream one, the Chomskyan one, the Jack and Duff one, and other ones, they all share the same basic idea that we have a special language ability which can't be dealt with by normal, the normal way we deal with accumulating and learning knowledge, right? So there's a special linguistic ability which has to explain the problem of how children get to acquire complex systems such as grammars without apparently any help, except being exposed to a language, and it can be any language. So they all, it's important to understand how they have in common, and then the question is how they variously differ. The difference with Jack and Duff is, apart from the fact that he includes phonology separately, right? That's a particular detail. He is interested, as we are, and he has always been interested in how language knowledge and language ability connects up with the mind in general. Whereas if you take the mainstream Chomskyan approach, Chomsky says, I want to first sort out what are the universal properties of all languages? What do all languages have in common? And that will lead me to an idea of what the child brings to the business of language acquisition when it doesn't have any cognitive maturity to understand it, to learn it, to find out about grammar, vocabulary, syllables, but nevertheless performs this little miracle when it's very young. What are these properties? And of course, they've become known as universal grammar, but they're really a set of properties which the child brings to the business of learning a language. So all Jackendorf does not depart from Chomsky in that respect. However, Chomsky says, I don't want to deal with language processing. I don't want to deal with semantics. I don't want to deal with, discourse analysis. I don't want to deal with language teaching. I want to just focus in a very rational, logical way on working out what these properties are. And out of time, it's almost like sort of theoretical physics. Once we've worked that out, then we know what makes human sounds into language. So whereas Jackendorf says, no, I want to know how that fits in with the mind in general and how it works. So if you're interested in how people acquire language and how people manage language, as they're listening and comprehending, all of that is much easier to do with Jackendorf.
One of Jackendorf's claims is that Chomskyan linguistics are too syntactocentric. So what would that mean, and why is that important or is it important in the MCF?
Yes. Okay. So in principle, the MCF could entertain a kind of a Chomskyan grammar, but Chomskyan grammar is not expressed in such a way that you can automatically plug it in to we deal with time passing in milliseconds when you're speaking and listening, and time passing over a period of time as an adult, for example, acquiring a language, or even a child. They don't do it in 1 month, right? That's one thing. Second thing is, of course, Jackendorf says no. Phonology, I want that to be a generative system in its own right. So his language faculty, as it were, his sort of core of language is a syntax and a phonology. So he has these two things which are equal partners. So it's kind of a dual system.
The third part of that system is also interesting, the conceptual part. So
yeah, okay. Yes, indeed. So and semantics, perhaps Jackendorf would have liked Chomsky to say semantics too belongs to that inner core, right? But he doesn't. And in a sense, Jackendorf has accepted the point. But of course, the conceptual system, which is what semantics is in a Jackendorf perspective, semantics is so crucial to language in general that you just can't leave it out of the picture. So there's a lot about the conceptual system in Jackendorf, and that is what's made it particularly interesting to not only to people who are interested in applying generative linguistics, but also to people who actually don't believe the whole business about child acquisition. They find a lot in Jackendorf which they can relate to.
And of course, we should mention that also the boundaries for the word language, what should it include?
Yes, that's been a bone of contention with generative linguists in the mainstream, because they haven't really, they've been doing stuff on their own, right? So some of the things they've said have been misunderstood. So you've got a core of language, a core system, as it were, which is special to human beings, right? So, birds have bird song, we have language, and this particular aspect of it, in the case of Jackendorf, it's phonology and syntax, right? But in both cases, that is the core of language. It's what makes language language. But if if you talk about language, it's a much wider thing. And in fact, in MCF, we make the point that when people learn language, produce language, and listen to language, it actually involves all of the mind. It just stretches out into all aspects of the mind, and that is also used when we don't use language to communicate. So if you've ever been in a situation where you're talking to someone who doesn't know your language and you don't know their language, but you need to communicate something with them, you find, if you persist, that you can transfer an awful lot of meaning without actually having a shared language. We can always communicate meaning, but you need language to communicate meaning using all the clever things we can say in language. They rely on this core.
One of the obstacles I know I had in trying to understand the MCF is that I did not really have an idea or an understanding of what processing is in the first place.
Okay.
So what is processing?
Okay. And this is something that Chomsky didn't want to involve because it complicated what he was really trying to do. So processing is what goes on in the head, if you like, in the mind or in the brain, depending on what you're interested in. What goes on in the head as you're actually listening to or producing language, right? And using, of course, syntax, phonology, using the whole set of resources you have to listen and to understand language. So processing is measured in milliseconds, right? Literally very small moments in time. And people interested in processing, psycholinguists, have concentrated on this almost exclusively for a long time. They're interested in measuring how people respond, and what's the machinery, as it were, that allows you to convert funny sounds hitting your eardrums into meaning. So from that point, the point at which sound hits your eardrums, or when you're older, when text hits your retina on the back, it's just waves. It's just waves. It's meaningless patterns. And once that once you pick up that in your ears or in your eyes, almost instantly, it seems to you, a meaning comes to you. It's a miracle. And so processing is what happens in between that first bit, when the waves hit you, and the meaning popping into your head. Quite complicated.
In one of your videos, you talk about the need to have a deep understanding of theories rather than a surface understanding of theories. And so how can we acquire a deep understanding of theories?
Yes, I mean, this is the problem when you start being interested in a lot of things at the same time, like, properties that make grammar and syntax, and how people perform when they're listening and comprehending, and how people go through various stages in acquisition. Once you do all that, life becomes very difficult. And people researching, especially language acquisition, really they're in an interdisciplinary area, right? So the more you look at it, the more questions you have to ask. And then you take something like working memory, for example, and you ask yourself, what is working memory? And because you're doing a lot of other things, you basically go for what you regard as what seems to be the theory that most people are familiar with, which in the case of working memory happens to be Alan Baddeley's pioneering work, right? It's still being developed, so it's not old hat, but he was a great pioneer. But in actual fact, in the contemporary literature, there are a lot of different approaches to working memory, and it's sort of the emphasis moved on. So what we wanted to do, since we had the time, was to look and choose which working memory theory we wanted to incorporate in the MCF, which was the going theory, which is the one that seems to be more accepted for researchers. They are looking at many things at the same time, but we have to eventually to go deeper, and hopefully our MCF framework is a way of getting into that, because we sort of do the work for other people. That's the way I like to look at it anyway.
I like what you did in other in one of your videos, where you pretend that you are making a series of questions to a hypothetical researcher, and you they're quite tough. You ask about working memory, attention, the lexicon, and I kept thinking, I kept hearing these questions, and I kept thinking, if this were my oral defense, I would be sweating. It's quite difficult.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Well, I had a group of psycholinguists in front of me, and I actually posed them these questions, saying, how much do you really know about working memory? If you had to stand up, I said, now, and talk about various things like executive function, working memory, all these things. Could you explain, what the theories available are, and why you choose the one you choose? And of course, people haven't had the time to do that mostly, and a lot of them were quite frightened too. So you wouldn't be the only person in the audience who was frightened.
I guess this brings us to the importance of frameworks, why we need a comprehensive theory to kind of get everything together in a neat way. We cannot have attention being used in a certain cognitive theory which clashes with our concept of working memory. If we cannot put it together, things don't make sense. We cannot produce evidence. So what is the importance of theories, and in this case of meta theories or frameworks? Why do we need a framework?
Yes, I think because we live in an interdisciplinary world now, and it's been going on a long time in the hard sciences, but now we're beginning to treat our own field as interdisciplinary. It seems to me that since we can't have yet a theory of everything, right? We at least need some kind of framework which can sort of look at different areas and try and integrate the basic principles together. That was why we called the MOGLE and now the MCF a framework. So it's an open-ended one. It's not one that answers all the questions. It's a framework which sets out the basic principles, which seem to be most supported by contemporary science, and shows how, as it were, a working model of the mind, but with lots of things yet to be developed. And my favorite metaphor, which is like all metaphors, it has strict limits, is it's a sort of space station, an international space station, which has different entry points, and people can go and with their module, they can fit, as long as it fits into the MCF space station, they can go on and develop the beginnings of what we've done into a much more sophisticated ways. I mean, we are not experts in visual cognition or auditory cognition or somatosensory. All of these things have to be done by experts, right? So it sort of reproduces what we think the model of the mind is, and that is a set of expert systems. And the expert systems are there in the basics, but the people have to develop it. Now, we, being linguists and to some extent psychologists, have actually elaborated that part of it much more, right? So that's where we put in our major work, trying to elaborate, add our expertise at least into it. But of course, there are lots of areas which are still very open. And it seems to me one problem we have is that when we talk to each other, we have different approaches. When we talk to each other, we're constantly talking to each other without having some shared principles, right?
It was a special feeling when I was reading your last book, the internal context of bilingual processing, because throughout the chapters, once you have all the modules that we will cover on the second video, you can use them to explain all sorts of psychological phenomena, and this is kind of the first time I had the chance to see such coherence. So I think that's very interesting. I can definitely see how the MCF would be a sort of space station where everything kind of connects.
Yes, it's kind of, we see it in a way as a kind of tool which people can use, and says, so in principle, for example, as I said, you could adapt a Chomskyan approach to the grammar part into the MCF, but you'd have to do a lot of work already done by Jackanoff, because he's very processing friendly, because you've never been interested in this. So you'd have to explain how these properties were, but you can certainly contribute the insights from mainstream Chomskyan linguistics and insert them into the right place, So it's that, in that sense, it's open-ended. People can try different approaches within the parameters, as it were, set by the framework.